Winston Churchill wrote history, 6 volumes of war memoirs. But what did he leave out? Here's the thing about Winston Churchill. If not for Hitler, he would likely be remembered as a failure if he was remembered at all. Before the Second World War elevated him to legendary status, Churchill's career was a catalogue of catastrophes that would have buried any ordinary politician. He had a superpower though, and it wasn't strategic brilliance, it was survival. No matter how badly he blundered, Churchill always came back. So let's start where the damage began, at Gallipoli. In early 1915, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was convinced he could break the stalemate of trench warfare by opening a new front against the Ottoman Empire. The plan was to force the Dardanelles Strait, seize Constantinople, and knock Turkey out of the war. On paper, it was bold. In practice, it was a bloodbath. The naval bombardment began in January 1915. The amphibious assault landed on April 25th, and what followed was 8 months of brutal trench warfare on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Allies committed nearly 480,000 men and suffered roughly 250,000 casualties, with 44,000 dead. The Turks lost even more, perhaps 65,000 killed. And for what? Not a single strategic objective was achieved. Churchill took the brunt of the blame because he'd championed the operation so forcefully. He was sacked from the Admiralty on May 21st, 1915. "I am the victim of a political intrigue," he told a friend. "I am finished." The humiliation haunted him for decades. When he stood to speak in the House of Commons, opponents would shout, "Remember the Dardanelles." When he ran for Parliament in 1923, hecklers called out the same thing. Churchill himself later admitted, "I seem to have been too ready to undertake tasks which were hazardous or even forlorn." After Gallipoli, Churchill did something remarkable. At 41 years old, he resigned from government, picked up a rifle, and went to the Western Front as an infantry officer with the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He served for 4 months, but his political career wasn't over. It was simply entering its next phase of controversy. For the next 2 decades, while Stanley Baldwin and then Neville Chamberlain dominated Conservative politics, and Chamberlain pursued his policy of appeasement, Churchill remained largely in the political wilderness, warning unheeded of the danger from Germany. By 1919, Churchill was Secretary of State for War, and his attention turned to Ireland. His name became permanently associated with the Black and Tans, those temporary constables sent to fight the IRA beginning in March 1920. Churchill didn't create the Black and Tans, but he stubbornly defended them long after their reputation for excessive violence had become impossible to deny. They burned down a large area of Cork in December 1920, driving moderates straight into the arms of Sinn Féin. Sir Henry Wilson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary that Churchill saw very little harm in this, and added that it horrified him. The Black and Tans blackened Britain's reputation worldwide, and Churchill's fingerprints were all over their deployment. Then came his stint as Chancellor of the Exchequer. In April 1925, Churchill announced Britain's return to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of $4.86 per pound. John Maynard Keynes had explicitly warned him this would cause deflation, unemployment, and unrest. Churchill even hosted a dinner to hear both sides of the argument, then chose wrong. The overvalued pound made British exports uncompetitive. Coal mining, textiles, and steel production all collapsed. The general strike of 1926 followed directly. Churchill later acknowledged the disaster with rare candour. "Everybody said that I was the worst Chancellor of the Exchequer that ever was." In June 2025, the Bank of England held a conference to mark the centenary of that decision, still analysing its implications 100 years later. Then came the Second World War, and Churchill became the lion who refused to surrender. The Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, and then the Battle of Britain that summer, gave the Churchill legend its foundation, and those triumphs were real. But even in his finest hour, the mistakes kept coming. In August 1941, with crated aircraft being loaded onto ships bound for Singapore, Churchill personally intervened to redirect them to Russia as a promise to Stalin. Half were sunk en route. Singapore's defences were left critically weakened, and on February 15, 1942, around 80,000 British, Indian and Australian soldiers surrendered to a Japanese force roughly half their size. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. Approximately 9,000 of those prisoners would die building the Burma-Thailand Railway, what survivors called the Death Railway. Churchill later wrote, "I ought to have known." But perhaps the most damning chapter is the Bengal Famine of 1943. Over 3 million people starved to death in Bengal, with the epicenter of suffering in and around Calcutta. And recent scientific research from the Indian Institute of Technology Gandhinagar, published in Geophysical Research Letters, confirmed what historians had long suspected. This was the only major famine in the Indian subcontinent between 1870 and 2016 that wasn't linked to drought or crop failure. It was, in the researchers' own words, a complete policy failure. Lord Wavell, the Viceroy, repeatedly requested food aid, and Churchill's war cabinet declined. Leopold Amery, the Secretary of State for India, recorded that Churchill explained at cabinet meetings that Bengalis were breeding like rabbits. The aid that finally came was too little and too late for the 3 million already dead. Churchill's defenders point to Japanese naval activity in the Bay of Bengal and global shipping shortages. His critics argue that his willingness to let millions die while preserving stockpiles for Europeans reveals something much darker than logistical difficulty. And then, with the war won, Churchill managed one final spectacular miscalculation. On June 4, 1945, in a party election broadcast, he declared that the Labour Party would have to fall back on some sort of a Gestapo to implement its policies. He was comparing Clement Attlee, who had served loyally in his own wartime coalition, to the Nazis. The British public, exhausted by war and hungry for social reform, were appalled. It was a particularly striking misjudgment, given that just weeks later, Churchill would be pulled from the Potsdam Conference mid-summit, replaced by Attlee, while Stalin and Truman looked on before the final agreements were even signed. On July 26th, the results came in. Labour won 47.7% of the vote, the Conservatives got 36.2%, and the swing of nearly 12 points remains the largest in British post-war history. Churchill, sitting on an approval rating of 83%, had managed to lose by a landslide. When Attlee arrived at Buckingham Palace, an uncomfortable silence reigned until he finally spoke. "I've won the election." King George replied, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." The debate over Churchill's mistakes hasn't faded. In 2020, protesters sprayed "was a racist" on his statue in Parliament Square. In 2021, Churchill College, Cambridge announced a series of events examining his racial views, prompting Churchill's own grandson to call the plan idiotic. These aren't just historical arguments, they're live cultural battles over how nations remember their heroes. What makes Churchill's record of mistakes so striking is not that he made them. Every leader makes mistakes. It's that the mythology built around him has so thoroughly obscured them. Churchill himself wrote 6 volumes of war memoirs, and he shaped the narrative. For decades, that narrative held. But real history is messier than mythology, and the complete record of Winston Churchill's mistakes reminds us that even the greatest leaders are capable of catastrophic failures that cost millions of lives and reshaped the world in ways we're still reckoning with today.